Late January 1945. In a headquarters map room, the war is pinned to cork and traced in grease pencil, blue and red lines crossing like veins. Men speak softly because the front is loud enough. For weeks, reports arrived in pieces. Here, pieces become decisions. Then a staff officer says it, almost casually, they're coming back. The sentence makes the room expand. On the paper, it is only an arrow and a boundary. In reality, it is two American armies, 1st and 9th, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, trucks, guns, and wounded men, engineers, medics, cooks, clerks, an army behind armies. They are about to pass from one set of orders to another. Not because they failed, but because a coalition trusted a temporary bargain. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stands over the table as if it were a lectern. His beret is absent here, the performance is quieter. He studies the map with practiced stillness, eyes measuring distances, junctions, river lines. He does not show loss, because in his mind control is a virtue, and a virtue should never look bruised. General Omar Bradley watches him and hears different sounds, the pauses between sentences, the careful way names are chosen, the deliberate neutrality of polite words. Bradley has commanded men long enough to know when an argument is being held in silence. In this room, authority is not shouted. It is negotiated. At the edge of the table, a liaison officer holds the transfer paperwork, forms, annexes, stamped copies that will move divisions as surely as any tank column. His pen hesitates. He realizes command can shift without a shot fired, and yet the consequences will still be counted in casualties, in delayed supplies, in orders misunderstood for a single hour. Beyond the windows, the Ardennes is thawing. Snow collapses into mud, and the roads that carried reinforcements now swallow jeeps to their axles. The battle smoke has drifted, and burnt villages sit in silence, counting the cost in smashed timbers alone. Inside, uniforms are dry, but pride is not. Alliances freeze more slowly than weather. This is the handback, Montgomery's temporary authority ending with signatures and a change of coloured pins. No banners fall, no gun salute, yet something is taken and something is returned. To understand why two American armies were ever handed over, we must rewind, back to crisis, necessity, and the moment a number became a weapon. 200,000 men is not a slogan in January 1945, it is a weight. It is the 1st Army and the 9th Army, whole headquarters, corps, divisions, shifted under a foreign commander because the front demanded it. On the map it looks like neat ink. On the roads it is convoys, mess lines, casualty trucks, and radios learning a new voice. The German winter offensive had split the Allied line like a sudden crack in ice. Fog and snow hit armour, telephone wires were cut, and units fought by instinct as much as by plan. In that kind of shock, normal hierarchies become luxuries, and luxuries kill. Bradley's headquarters was displaced, Patton's Third Army pivoted, and in the north the seams between British and American sectors mattered more than pride. The map had to be redrawn while the shooting continued. Dwight Eisenhower answered the crisis the way an engineer answers a fire: isolate the problem, restore flow, prevent collapse. He needed one northern hand to coordinate counterattacks, supply routes and boundaries, and he needed it immediately. Pride could be negotiated later, coherence could not. Somewhere behind the front, an American staff officer sits at a typewriter, fingers stiff from cold, and composes the orders that make it official. The wording is polite, almost clinical. Yet he feels the sting in every line, his army placed beneath another flag's direction. He also knows the alternative, confusion, and a gap the Germans would widen. Montgomery inherited the American formations and immediately gave them his grammar, timetables, boundaries, rehearsed attacks, a tempo controlled like a metronome. In the chaos of the bulge, that order had value. But order imposed is different from order shared, and soldiers notice the difference even when it works. The shock, in the end, was not that he commanded Americans in an emergency. Coalitions do that to survive. The shock was what followed, how he later described those days, and where he placed himself in the story. In war, narratives can harden faster than trenches. When the moment came to take the armies back, it would be framed as punishment by those who wanted a simpler tale. In truth, it was maintenance, tightening the bolts before the machine shook itself apart. That stripping was less revenge than correction, a line drawn before trust failed. And the first crack was already forming in a single speech. By early January 1945, the bulge was shrinking, pressed flat by American counterattacks and the slow return of air power as skies cleared. The line, torn open in December, began to stitch itself closed. Roads reopened, supply dumps moved forward again, and headquarters could think beyond the next 6 hours. Yet as the gun settled into a steadier rhythm, a different kind of threat rose, one that could not be shelled into silence. It arrived in the form of words. Montgomery spoke with the confidence of a man describing a problem he believes he solved. He explained the Northern battle as a lesson in order, how chaos was steadied, how positions were restored, how the enemy was contained. American troops were praised in the language of professionalism. But the structure of the story placed the British commander at its center, as if the crisis had been waiting for a particular hand to arrive. It was not an accusation. It was worse. It was a framing. To American commanders, the tone landed like appropriation. The Ardennes had been an American ordeal, American divisions cut to pieces in forests, American engineers blowing bridges, American medics working in frozen barns. When that suffering was narrated as evidence of British stewardship, it felt less like cooperation and more like custody. Pride in a coalition can survive hardship, it struggles to survive being rewritten. British leadership heard the outrage differently. To them, the American reaction sounded thin-skinned, almost adolescent, a refusal to accept that coalition war demands shared credit and shared command. If the Americans could not bear a British general speaking confidently, what did that say about unity when the next crisis arrived? Suspicion, once planted, grows in both directions. In Bradley's headquarters, a summary of the remarks is passed along, pages still warm from a mimeograph machine. Bradley reads without visible anger. He does not feel insulted. He feels erased, his soldiers reduced to supporting actors in someone else's narrative, their exhaustion turned into stage lighting for a different hero. In war, men can accept being ordered. They struggle to accept being recast. Eisenhower understands the danger at once. If senior American commanders conclude the coalition is unfair, the command structure becomes brittle. Trust is not decoration, it is logistics. When trust fails, coordination fails, and coordination is what keeps armies alive. Across the Atlantic, Churchill moves quickly, praising American sacrifice with deliberate emphasis, as if placing sandbags against a flood. The question now is not who won the bulge. The question is what power looks like when the emergency ends, who gets their armies back, and on what terms. Bernard Montgomery entered the war with the mind of an engineer and the posture of a conductor. He preferred battles that could be designed, artillery tables checked, routes measured, reserves staged, timings rehearsed until uncertainty was reduced to a minimum. His set-piece method had a logic that soothed frightened staffs. If the enemy could be forced to meet a prepared blow, surprise became manageable. In his world, momentum was not seized, it was scheduled and every detail had its hour. From that philosophy came his central belief: morale is built by certainty, and certainty must be shown. Montgomery spoke in absolutes, drew bold lines, and repeated plans until even tired captains could recite them. He believed hesitation bred fear, and fear bred defeat. So he performed confidence as a duty, not a vanity, arriving early, standing straight, promising success in clear, public language. The promise was meant to stiffen spines before bullets did to make tomorrow feel already decided for them. Inside his headquarters, the atmosphere matched the doctrine. Briefings were structured like sermons, with Montgomery at the front, delivering conclusions before questions could form. Maps were not debated, they were displayed. Staff officers learned to offer solutions, never doubts, because dissent was treated as weakness that might leak into the ranks. A young major could feel the room tighten if he suggested an alternative route or a slower timetable. Discipline created clarity, and clarity demanded obedience even when costs rose. Earlier victories, North Africa, the careful preparations before Normandy, the ability to speak to newspapers in neat, quotable phrases helped build a public myth of Montgomery as the dependable general. In Britain, he became a symbol that competence still existed in a frightening age. In America, some admired his order, others bristled at his certainty. Myth is a kind of armor, and it can protect a commander from criticism long after conditions change. But armor also dulls the feeling of impact inside. When a method is praised as salvation, entitlement follows quietly. Montgomery came to believe that if his approach produced results, then the war itself should be arranged around his tempo, his boundaries, his preferred risks. He was not asking for medals, he was asking for authorship. Coalitions, however, do not grant authorship easily. They are made of nations with separate electorates, separate graves, separate memories. To insist on one script is to invite resentment from partners who pay their share. Here lies the irony that runs through coalition war. Control can win battles by limiting surprise, by conserving strength, by making frightened men feel held in a firm hand. Yet control can also narrow a commander's sight. It tempts him to treat allies as components in a design rather than proud equals with their own pain. A plan can be flawless and still offend. An offense in 1945 was another kind of vulnerability, because it turned partners into variables, not friends. Bradley, by contrast, carried no theatrical certainty. He spoke less, listened longer, and measured success in the ledger of replacements and graves. Where Montgomery believed confidence must be performed, Bradley believed responsibility must be endured. That difference would matter more than tactics once the bulge closed and the microphones came out. For if Montgomery's style made him look indispensable in crisis, it also made him dangerous in peace. And Bradley was returning to reclaim what had been lent to him. Omar Bradley never looked like the kind of general posters were made for. He did not cultivate the silhouette, the catchphrase, the public certainty. His voice carried the flatness of the Midwest and the patience of a staff officer who had spent years turning chaos into columns. Where others seemed to enlarge the war with personality, Bradley tried to shrink it back into something that could be managed: routes, rations, replacements, and the hard arithmetic of endurance. His belief was simple, and it was heavy. Soldiers were not props. They were a debt. Command, to Bradley, was not the art of being admired, it was the discipline of being accountable. Every order carried a cost, and the cost did not disappear when the map pins moved forward. It returned at night in casualty figures, in medical reports, in the quiet faces of men who had learned what an artillery barrage did to a friendship. There were moments when that belief stopped being philosophy and became posture. Bradley would walk among tired men after an offensive, not for spectacle, but because he needed to see what his decisions looked like in human form. Mud on trouser cuffs, unshaved faces, boots that had been wet for days. He absorbed their fatigue as if it belonged to him, because in a way it did. A commander could delegate tasks, but not responsibility. That was why he distrusted theatrics. He had seen how slogans could make slaughter feel clean, how a confident briefing could turn casualties into background noise. Applause is a tempting sound in wartime because it suggests meaning. But Bradley believed meaning had to survive the morgue. He preferred restraint, not because he lacked emotion, but because he feared what emotion could become when it was performed. Bradley respected British competence. He had fought alongside it, depended on it, and learned from it. He knew Montgomery could bring structure, and he did not deny that coalition war required compromise. But he could not tolerate American sacrifice being narrated as British stewardship, as though American armies were wards rather than partners. The difference was not vanity. It was ownership of loss. A nation that buries its sons does not accept having their story filed under someone else's method. And beneath the personal, the coalition carried a wide attention. Britain needed status in a war where its manpower was stretched and its empire was fraying. America demanded fairness in a war it was now paying for with industrial might and mass graves. Both needs were understandable. Both, if mishandled, could become corrosive. Alliances are not broken only by defeats, they are broken by slights that seem small until they collect. So when Eisenhower later made the emergency decision to place Bradley's armies under Montgomery, Bradley did not fight it in public. He swallowed it as necessity, the way a man accepts a tourniquet, tight, painful, but meant to keep the body alive. He accepted it, and then he waited, quietly, for the day the ledger could be brought back under his own hand. Because December was coming, and with it a crisis that would force pride to stand aside. December 1944 did not begin with drama in the map rooms. It began with routine, patrol reports, supply tables, weather forecasts. Then, in the pre-dawn hours, the German winter offensive tore into the Ardennes and turned routine into rupture. Fog and snow swallowed aircraft. Telephone lines went dead. Radios carried fragments, units naming crossroads instead of coordinates, battalions asking who their neighbour was, commanders trying to rebuild a front from scattered voices. In a matter of hours, headquarters found themselves fighting for information as much as territory. Eisenhower understood what that kind of break meant. When boundaries dissolve, armies can bleed without knowing where the wound is. He did not have the luxury of perfect consensus. He needed a functioning Northern command at once, one set of hands to coordinate routes, reserves, and counterstrokes. The crisis was sharp enough to cut through normal arrangements, and in that cut, the Supreme Commander reached for the simplest tool available, impose coherence fast, even if pride would pay the bill later. The temporary solution was blunt. American armies north of the Bulge would fall under Montgomery's direction, not as a judgment on American ability, but as a bridge across a broken command seam. Paperwork moved faster than divisions. Boundaries were redrawn in pencil while the shooting continued in steel. To the men in the woods, it changed nothing about the cold. To the men behind the maps, it changed everything about authority. In a headquarters tent lit by a single lamp, American officers brief a foreign commander on American blood and American terrain. They swallow hard, not because they doubt the British general's competence, but because they feel the symbolism in the act. They describe roads their engineers built, villages their infantry defended, and units that have already been chewed down to half strength. Their words are precise, professional, and restrained, yet each sentence carries a quiet awareness. We are explaining our own suffering to someone who did not earn it with us. Montgomery receives the responsibility with the composure of a man who believes order is a moral duty. He speaks of boundaries, timing, and the necessity of discipline. He does not gloat in the room. But the transfer confirms something he has long suspected, that his method, controlled tempo, rehearsed counterattacks, certainty performed, ought to be the coalition's default. In crisis, his belief looks like virtue. And virtue, when praised too often, can drift into entitlement without announcing the change. For Bradley, the moment lands differently. He experiences it as necessity and as an insult he cannot afford to contest while German armour is still advancing. His instinct is not to shout, but to measure. He knows that arguing now would fracture the very unity the Germans are trying to exploit. So he accepts the tourniquet, even as it bites. He holds his reaction in reserve, because a commander who spends his authority on pride may have none left for survival. This is where the fuse is lit. Temporary authority in a coalition is tolerable when everyone agrees it is temporary. It becomes toxic when it is framed as permanent salvation, when staff work is turned into public ownership, when emergency measures are later spoken of as proof of superiority. The Bulge will be fought with tanks, infantry, and artillery. But it will also be fought with liaison officers, boundary lines, and nerves stretched thin by the knowledge that allies can be wounded by words as surely as by shells. And as the snow deepens and the front strains, the coalition's most dangerous battlefield is not yet the forest, it is the story that will be told afterward. Before dawn in mid-December 1944, the Ardennes looked harmless, dark timber, narrow roads, villages half asleep under winter. Then the German offensive came through fog and snow, not as a grand parade of armour, but as pressure applied where the Allies were thin. The weather was part of the plan. Low clouds strangled Allied air power, and the forest swallowed sound and distance. Surprise did not need genius, it needed concealment. In the first hours, units learned the same lesson in different places. When visibility collapses, certainty collapses with it. From a distance, the Battle of the Bulge is described as a single bulge on a line. Up close, it was fractured into hundreds of separate fights. A platoon holds a roadblock at a bend in the trees, not knowing if the next unit is 2 miles away or already overrun. A battalion commander hears gunfire to the north and cannot tell if it is his flank collapsing or a neighbour's counterattack. Tanks appear like shadows between farmhouses. Infantry moves through snow that muffles footsteps and makes every field a delay. The enemy's advantage is not only firepower, it is confusion. Higher command fought a different battle, rebuilding a coherent picture from broken messages. Maps filled with question marks. Phone lines failed, and radios carried voices that were cold, hurried, and sometimes wrong. The front did not simply move, it blurred. That blur is lethal in modern war. A division cannot be supplied if no one is sure where its rear begins. Artillery cannot be massed if boundaries are uncertain. In such conditions, command is not pride or rank. It is clarity: who answers to whom, who owns which road, who can shift a reserve without creating a gap elsewhere. Eisenhower's decision to shift authority was not theatre. It was systems engineering under fire. Coalition war adds complexity, different staffs, different habits, different expectations of how quickly orders should travel and how bluntly they should be given. In crisis, a fragmented command structure can produce a fragmented defense, and fragmentation invites catastrophe. By placing American armies under a single northern direction, he tried to restore a basic rule of survival: one battlefield, one plan, one set of priorities. The cost would be paid in pride, but the alternative would be paid in ground, and then in lives. A liaison officer felt that cost in his hands. He drove icy roads with orders sealed in a folder, the paper somehow heavier than ammunition. The jeep's headlights caught drifting snow, and every junction looked the same until a signpost appeared at the last second. At checkpoints, tired sentries studied his pass as if it might be a trick. He could smell burnt fuel in the air, hear distant artillery rolling like weather. His job was simple: deliver decisions, yet he understood the truth: in a crisis, a single delayed message can kill more men than a missed shot. Montgomery's method, once applied, brought structure that the battlefield could use. Boundaries were clarified. Timings were set. Counterstrokes were planned with a controlled tempo, not because speed was unimportant, but because speed without coordination is only panic. In the north, where roads were few and units interlocked in narrow corridors, the discipline mattered. Staff work became a weapon, arranging artillery support, controlling movement so columns did not choke each other, ensuring that when the counterattack came, it came as a coordinated weight, not as scattered courage. But every solution carried a shadow. Many Americans felt managed rather than partnered, as if their endurance had been placed under a foreign hand without their consent. They were not refusing orders, they were carrying them while counting the cost. Casualties climbed in the frozen woods, men lost to shells they never saw, to exposure in foxholes that filled with ice, to ambulances that could not reach them in time. For soldiers paying in blood, the idea that their struggle might later be narrated as someone else's lesson created a private bitterness. It did not stop them fighting. It sat beside their discipline, growing quietly. This was the revelation the bulge exposed. In coalition war, effectiveness and resentment can grow in the same hour. A plan can save a front and still damage trust. A commander can bring order and still lose goodwill. The Germans had attacked with tanks and infantry, but the deeper danger was always political, that the alliance might begin to treat itself as a set of competing stories. And as the line finally steadied, the next fight began over what would be said and who would be allowed to say it. When the front is uncertain, the public demands certainty. In December 1940, for the Ardennes offensive did not only tear at the Allied line, it tore at the Allied story. Newspapers needed headlines. Families wanted names, explanations, reassurance that the war still moved in the right direction. Politicians watched the maps the way gamblers watch cards, measuring risk and asking who, exactly, was in control. In that atmosphere, language became a form of terrain. Whoever held the narrative held something like morale, and morale was one of the few resources that could not be shipped from America. Briefings were no longer routine updates. They became operations in themselves, planned, timed, and executed with purpose. A commander could calm fear with a careful sentence or spread panic with a careless one. A spokesman could strengthen unity by sharing credit or weaken it by suggesting one nation was carrying another. In coalition war, words travel faster than divisions. They cross oceans in hours, and what they carry is not ammunition, but implication. In a press room that smelled of damp wool and cigarette smoke, a war correspondent watched the generals talk. He had covered battles long enough to hear the difference between facts and framing. The map behind the speakers was the same map the staffs used, yet it was being turned into a stage. Each phrase seemed measured, what was emphasized, what was omitted, which unit was named, which was described only as forces. The correspondent sensed that victory claims were being placed like artillery, not fired at the enemy, but positioned for the record. He wrote notes, but he also watched faces, because faces often reveal what communiques hide. British and American communication styles clashed in the way cultures often do under stress. The British tradition favoured controlled understatement in public and sharp certainty in private. It could sound, to Americans, like condescension dressed as calm. The American style favoured plain, direct emphasis on effort and sacrifice. It could sound, to British ears, like theatrical indignation. Each side misread the other's intent. A British general's confidence was heard as ownership. An American general's outrage was heard as insecurity. And in that misunderstanding, the alliance discovered a vulnerability no German tank could exploit alone. German propaganda listened closely. Berlin's microphones could not reach Allied soldiers in their foxholes, but they could reach doubt in the rear. Every Allied disagreement was a gift, every hint of rivalry a lever. If the Western Allies began to sound like competitors rather than partners, it would not matter how many bridges they held. The enemy would have found a way to slow them without firing. In modern war, fracture is a weapon and narrative is its delivery system. Eisenhower saw the problem as clearly as any frontline emergency. He tightened message discipline, fewer voices, clearer lines, strict coordination between headquarters. Statements were drafted, checked and smoothed, not to lie, but to avoid unnecessary sparks. In calmer times, such control might have been resented. In the bulge, it was a form of defense. Yet even Eisenhower could not fully contain one voice, Montgomery's, because Montgomery understood publicity as part of command, and he believed certainty must be performed. The danger was not that Montgomery spoke to the press. The danger was the geometry of his story, where he placed himself, where he placed others, and what that arrangement suggested about who had saved whom. In a coalition, perception is operational. A partner who feels diminished does not fight less bravely, but he may cooperate less willingly. And cooperation is what makes combined arms possible across national lines. As the battle continued, the Allies fought two wars at once. One was in the forests and on the roads, with artillery, fuel and exhausted infantry. The other was in press rooms and communiques, with phrasing, emphasis, and the careful allocation of credit. Both wars had consequences, and the second could damage the first without a single casualty report to warn you. The Ardennes would eventually be sealed, and the Germans would be pushed back. But microphones would remain, waiting for the next confident sentence. Because in modern war, what armies build in mud and blood can be undone in a warm room by a man who believes the story belongs to him. Early January 1945, as the bulge began to collapse under Allied pressure, Montgomery faced the press with the calm assurance of a man explaining a problem already solved. The winter offensive had shocked the Western Front, and for weeks the public had lived with uncertainty. Maps in newspapers shaded with ominous arrows, rumours of breakthroughs, and the quiet fear that the war might suddenly become longer and more expensive. Into that uncertainty, Montgomery offered clarity. He spoke of organisation, of boundaries re-established, of a situation brought under control. For listeners far from the Ardennes, his certainty sounded like safety. He did not deny American courage. He praised American troops, spoke of their fighting qualities, and acknowledged their endurance in difficult weather. Yet the shape of his account carried another message. In his narrative, the chaos existed first, then order arrived. an order that seemed to radiate outward from his headquarters. He described himself as the steadying hand, the coordinator of salvation, the man who tidied a disorderly battlefield into coherence. In coalition war, it is not only what is said that matters, it is where the spotlight falls. To many Americans, that spotlight felt misplaced. The bulge had been paid for in American blood, battalions ground down at roadblocks, artillery crews firing until barrels glowed, medics dragging the wounded through snow that numbed fingers into uselessness. When those realities were folded into a story that placed one commander at the center, the praise sounded like an annex, an afterthought appended to a claim. The war had become a narrative, and the narrative had an owner. Bradley heard about the press conference the way a commander often hears about things that matter, through summaries, fragments, and the tone of men who bring the news. He listened, and what struck him was not open criticism. It was possession. The language carried the quiet assumption that American formations had been managed into survival, that their ordeal was meaningful primarily as evidence of someone else's competence. His soldiers, men he had watched march, bleed, and harden, were being recast as supporting actors in a British demonstration. Bradley did not react with theatrics, because that was not his way. But in the tight rooms where senior American officers gathered, the reaction was fierce. It moved through staff corridors like pressure in a sealed pipe. Men spoke of humiliation, of public rebuttal, of resignations, gestures that would have been unthinkable only weeks earlier when the Germans were still advancing. The anger was not simply personal, it was institutional. If American sacrifice could be narrated as foreign stewardship, then what did partnership really mean? Eisenhower saw the danger in the language of strategy. If this became a public Anglo-American feud, Germany gained without firing a shot. A divided coalition would slow its tempo, complicate its planning, and tempt each side to fight for credit instead of victory. Allied unity was not a sentimental ideal, it was an operational requirement. The Western Front was an immense machine of logistics and air power, and machines fail when their parts begin to compete. So Eisenhower moved to contain the blast. He tightened control of communications, urged restraint, and worked behind the scenes to keep the dispute from becoming a headline war. His authority was supreme on paper, but coalition authority is always partly emotional, dependent on a sense of fairness. He understood that if American commanders lost faith in the coalition's equity, no set of orders could fully repair it. Churchill, too, acted as if he could feel the tremor across the Atlantic. He publicly emphasized American sacrifice with deliberate care, praising not only bravery, but the scale of effort, as if placing weight back onto a balance that had tipped. It was not flattery, it was stabilization. Britain needed America's confidence, and America needed recognition that its losses were not being used as someone else's stage. For Montgomery, the moment was revealing. He had offered what he believed was constructive clarity, the kind of certainty he thought morale required. Yet he had misjudged the coalition's sensitivity to narrative ownership. In a war fought by allies, the story belongs to no single voice. And the more he insisted on framing the bulge as a lesson in his method, the more he turned a temporary authority into a permanent grievance. By mid-January, the military emergency was fading. The front was stabilizing, the weather improving, and command lines could be restored to their normal shape. The inevitability now settled in like cold returning after a brief thaw. The temporary arrangement could not remain one day longer than necessary. Because after that press conference, it was no longer just a question of who gave orders. It was a question of who owned the meaning of those orders. By mid-January 1945, the Ardennes emergency was no longer a wound that bled uncontrollably. The German thrust had been contained, its spearheads blunted, and forced back along the same frozen roads they had used for surprise. The Northern Front stabilized into something recognizable again. Lines that could be held, sectors that could be supplied, plans that extended beyond tomorrow. And with stability came a truth that coalitions cannot avoid. What is tolerated in crisis becomes questionable in recovery. For Bradley, That change mattered. Necessity had justified many indignities in December, but necessity was losing its claim. The insult, his armies placed under another commander, could be borne while the enemy advanced. It became harder to bear once the enemy began to retreat. A commander's authority is not only a chain of orders, it is a chain of accountability. It must match the systems that keep an army alive: communications, logistics, and the national responsibility for casualties. When Americans died, American commanders would answer. When American supplies moved, American depots and American priorities would decide. A temporary wartime convenience could not become a permanent distortion. Coalition command is often described as a question of personalities, but in practice it is mechanics. Radios do not care about pride, but they care very much about clarity. Convoys do not move faster because a general is famous. They move faster because routes are coordinated and priorities are consistent. When two nations share a front, the command structure must fit the flow of information and material, or else friction multiplies. In the Ardennes, friction had been accepted as the price of survival. Now survival was no longer the only goal. Efficiency returned, and with it the demand for proper shape. Bradley understood this without raising his voice. His restraint was not passive, it was strategic. He did not storm into headquarters to demand what was his. He waited until the calendar made the argument for him, until the emergency that had required the transfer had clearly passed, and any continuation would look less like necessity and more like preference. There is a particular strength in waiting when you have cause to be angry. It tells everyone in the room that you are not fighting for ego. You are fighting for legitimacy. Eisenhower could feel the same clock ticking. He had imposed the temporary arrangement to prevent catastrophe, but he also knew coalition survival required American commanders to feel represented, not administered. The bulge had tested not only Allied firepower, but Allied trust. After Montgomery's public framing of events, that trust had thinned. If Eisenhower allowed the temporary command to linger, it would be read not as prudence, but as endorsement. And endorsement, in a coalition, is a dangerous thing to misunderstand. So the handback process began, not with drama, but with paperwork, conferences, and careful boundaries restored. It was the kind of turning point that never appears in heroic paintings. No charge, no flag planted on a ridge. Yet it carried strategic weight. A war of machines depends on quiet decisions, and this was one of them. Eisenhower's task was to repair the coalition's internal alignment before it warped under strain. Montgomery sensed the shift. A commander attuned to control can feel when control slips. His authority over American formations had once been a tool, useful, justifiable, even praised by those who valued order in crisis. Now it was becoming a liability, not because he had suddenly become incompetent, but because he had become politically radioactive. In a coalition, the most dangerous commander is not the one who fails. It is the one who succeeds while leaving partners feeling diminished. Success can feed resentment more efficiently than defeat, because it comes wrapped in moral claims. And then the number returns, 200,000. In staff language it is 1st Army and 9th Army, units and sectors, boundaries and liaison channels. In human terms, it is a moving continent, columns of trucks, artillery parks, headquarters tents, signal companies, engineers, field hospitals, replacement depots. It is the slow, grinding motion of an industrial army changing direction. Tectonic plates do not move quickly, but when they do, they reshape landscapes. Here, the landscape is command, and the force that moves it is a signature on an order. What had been granted in emergency was now being revoked in recovery. That revocation was not petty, it was meaning. It was the coalition acknowledging that temporary authority must end before it hardens into resentment. In war, victories are measured in towns taken and lines advanced. But some victories are quieter: the restoration of trust, the rebalancing of pride, the decision to keep the machine turning without grinding itself apart. Bradley returned to the room, not as a man demanding revenge, but as a commander reclaiming responsibility. And as the documents began to circulate, one question hung in the air. How would the handback be received by the man who had grown accustomed to being at the center of the story? The handback did not look like a victory. It looked like administration, clerks, liaison officers, and staff colonels moving between rooms with folders held tight against their chests. In late January 1945, the war was still being fought in ruined villages and frozen fields, yet inside headquarters the decisive movement was quieter. A colored pin was lifted from one side of a map and placed on another. A boundary line was erased and drawn again. Flags changed on paper in seconds. Pride did not. For weeks, First Army and Ninth Army had lived inside an emergency arrangement. The order had saved coherence at a moment when coherence was scarce. Now, with the bulge reduced and the front rejoined, the logic of that arrangement expired. Coalition war can tolerate improvisation, but it cannot live permanently in exception. The machinery has to return to its intended design, or else the strain begins to break teeth inside the gears. Bradley reasserted operational direction without ceremony. He did it the way he did most things, by restoring the chain of accountability and letting the work speak for itself. American communications channels were rethreaded. Planning conferences returned to familiar patterns. Supply priorities aligned again with the American logistical system that fed those armies. The effect was immediate, not in fireworks, but in friction. Orders moved with fewer intermediaries. Liaison burdens eased. Decisions no longer had to travel through a foreign headquarters before reaching American corps commanders, who would pay the cost of delays with American casualties. For the men in the staff sections, the day carried a physical relief. In an office lit by a stove that never quite warmed the air, American staff officers exhaled as if they had been holding their breath for a month. The relief was real, but so was the bitterness that lingered like smoke after a fire. They were not only reacting to what had been done, an emergency transfer that could be justified. They were reacting to what had been said afterward and what the words implied about ownership of their struggle. Bureaucracy can be endured. Humiliation is harder to file. The paperwork itself was precise, almost antiseptic. Paragraphs stated authority, dates, coordinating instructions. It read like a machine manual because that is what modern armies are, machines of men and fuel needing clear interfaces to function. Yet behind those paragraphs sat memory. Roads clogged with refugees, units cut off, the long nights when nobody knew if the Germans would reach the Meuse. The handback did not erase those nights. It simply declared that the coalition would not allow those nights to become a permanent reordering of respect. Montgomery maintained composure. He had been trained in class and in command to show control even when control was taken away. He did not protest loudly. He did not stage a scene. He studied the maps, listened to the arrangements, and accepted the formalities with the same deliberate calm he used in battle planning. But the message was unmistakable. His authority over American forces had been conditional, granted by crisis, not by right. The condition had been trust, and trust, once strained, does not return on schedule. There is an irony in coalition war that cannot be avoided. A capable commander can lose trust faster than he loses battles. Battles are measured in ground and bodies. Trust is measured in perception, tone, and the unspoken sense of fairness. Montgomery's organizational skill had been useful. His confidence had been, at moments, stabilizing. Yet his handling of the narrative, his instinct to place himself at the center, had turned competence into provocation. In a coalition, the war is not won only by doing the right thing. It is won by ensuring partners feel seen while it is done. Outside the headquarters, the front did not pause to honor any administrative milestone. Units refit, replacements arrived, artillery shifted forward. The next phase waited, rivers to cross, lines to break, Germany to finish. The Rhine was still ahead, and behind it the final collapse of a regime that had wagered Europe on brutality and speed. The Allies needed tempo now, not just in operations, but in unity. Every day of friction was a day the enemy could use. That is why the handback mattered. It was not a personal rebuke disguised as procedure. It was coalition maintenance, tightening the alliance before the final push. And it carried a quiet lesson that the war had taught repeatedly. Commanders can borrow another nation's armies in an emergency, but they cannot borrow that nation's pride. Eisenhower's most decisive weapon in January 1945 was not an armored division or a bomber wing. It was a boundary. The battle in the Ardennes had been compressed back into a line that could be held, but the coalition itself still carried a bruise where pride had been struck. In a single winter month, unity had proven both essential and fragile, and now the Supreme Commander had to do what field commanders rarely enjoy doing: repair relationships without weakening the front. The boundary began as procedure, because procedure is the only language strong enough to restrain vanity without declaring war on it. Apologies were encouraged, sometimes demanded, not as moral theatre, but as maintenance, like tightening bolts after a bridge has shaken. Protocols were clarified. Press guidance was refined. The hierarchy was reasserted with a firmness that did not need shouting, because its authority came from necessity and from the knowledge that there could be no second bulge in the alliance itself. The climax was not a confrontation of temper. There was no dramatic scene of men slamming doors and shouting in corridors. It was quieter, and therefore more permanent. Coalition medicine is administered in controlled doses, a reminder here, a limitation there, a decision that looks administrative but lands with the weight of law. Eisenhower understood that anger, even justified anger, would only create more heat in a system already overheating. What he needed was containment, pressure applied in the right place, calmly, until behavior changed. An aide watched him work and learned something about power. Ike sat with papers arranged neatly, listening to complaints without letting them become performances. He asked questions that forced clarity. He offered no grand moral speeches, because he knew men rarely change when they are publicly corrected. Instead, he created a framework in which correction was unavoidable. The aide realized that the Supreme Commander fought with steadiness rather than spectacle. At the moment, others wanted emotion. Eisenhower used discipline. It was not coldness. It was control used for a purpose larger than pride. Montgomery felt the new limits as a narrowing of air. He was not dismissed. There was no formal humiliation, no public announcement that made him a villain. But his influence contracted because it was now managed. The coalition did not need him to disappear. It needed him to behave. Command channels were tightened so that American forces would not again sit under his direction without clear conditions. Public messaging was guarded, so that no single voice could again dominate the narrative of a shared battle. In a coalition, management is sometimes the only alternative to rupture. Bradley's dignity was restored, and with it the confidence of the American command structure. Dignity here did not mean personal honor alone. It meant the assurance that American blood would be commanded and credited within an American chain of responsibility. It meant that sacrifice would not be treated as raw material for another man's myth. Once that assurance returned, American leaders could focus again on the work that truly mattered: breaking Germany's remaining defenses, crossing rivers, and driving the war to its end. Germany had watched the alliance carefully, searching for the moment when strain would become separation. The Nazi leadership had long hoped that the Western Allies might splinter, over casualties, over politics, over ego, before the final collapse. The bulge had been, in part, a gamble on confusion. But confusion did not arrive in the way Germany wanted. Instead, it forced the Allies to recognize their weaknesses and repair them. As Eisenhower set the boundary, Germany's last hope of Allied rupture faded. The machine began turning smoothly again, not because emotions vanished, but because discipline returned. This is the moral irony at the heart of the climax. The alliance survived not because every leader was humble, but because one leader was willing to limit heroism when it became dangerous. Eisenhower did not need Montgomery to be small. He needed Montgomery not to claim what the coalition had earned together. In a war of nations, no one is allowed to own the story outright. The boundary existed to remind everyone of that truth. And with that boundary set, the guns could speak again in their proper language, logistics, timing, and mass, while the microphones were quietly placed back under guard. But the question remained, hanging over the map room like smoke after a fire. What would this narrowing of influence do to Montgomery's sense of himself as the war moved toward its final act? After the bulge was pressed back into the line, the Western Allies did what large, disciplined armies do when their systems are restored. They accelerated. The map began to move eastward again, not in sudden leaps, but in steady pressure. Bridges rebuilt, roads repaired, fuel pushed forward in long columns that turned the countryside into a conveyor belt. The public convulsions of January softened. Statements became cleaner, less personal, more carefully shared. The microphones were still present, but now they stood behind guards of protocol. Bradley's armies fought under Bradley again, and the difference was felt in the ordinary mechanics that decide battles long before headlines do. Supply priorities aligned with his operational rhythm. Combined arms, the interlocking use of infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, and air power, returned to a tempo familiar to American staff work. It did not make the fighting easy. It made it coherent. Coherence in 1945 was a weapon, the ability to keep pressure constant, to prevent German units from finding time to regroup, to make every retreat more costly than the last. Down in the ranks, the politics of command was distant noise. A GI hears that the command's been sorted the way a man hears that the weather might clear, useful, but not poetic. He cares less about who sat at which table in a headquarters than about whether tomorrow's orders will be clear, whether his platoon will have ammunition when it matters, whether the route on the march card leads to a warm barn or another frozen ditch. His war is measured in small certainties: a hot canteen cup, a dry pair of socks, a sergeant who knows the plan. If sorting command produces those certainties, then it is worth it. If it does not, then it is just talk. Montgomery remained prominent, because prominence is not easily erased once built. He still commanded British and Canadian forces, still planned operations, still carried the authority of a decorated name. But his political leverage was reduced, and his speeches carried less freedom. The coalition had learned in winter that one voice could shake the machine, so the machine adjusted. The boundaries around narrative were tightened, not to silence talent, but to prevent talent from becoming ownership. A capable commander was kept in the system, yet the system now insisted on limits. The unseen cost of the earlier friction did not vanish simply because the handback was completed. Friction consumes time, and time is the currency armies spend in lives. When staffs hesitate, men wait in the open. When boundaries are unclear, artillery fires late. When leaders argue over credit, the enemy enjoys hours that should have been denied to him. Coalition war multiplies strength, but it also multiplies the points where delay can occur. By January's end, Eisenhower was determined to pay that cost no longer than necessary. Churchill and Eisenhower continued balancing national pride with shared mission, treating language like explosives because they understood how easily it could detonate. Praise had to be distributed with precision. Criticism had to be buried or expressed privately. Even silence could be strategic. In quieter ways than artillery, the leaders of the alliance managed the moral economy of respect. Who felt valued, who felt slighted, who felt seen. They did it because they knew the enemy still listened, and because they knew democracies do not fight well when their citizens suspect unfairness inside the coalition. And so the story changed. Not the story of the war's purpose. Germany still had to be defeated, but the story of how victories would be presented. Less personal myth, more shared effort, fewer opportunities for one nation to feel used as a stage for another. The Rhine loomed ahead, a physical barrier and a psychological one, and the Allies needed every ounce of unified momentum to break through it. The bulge had taught them that the front could be repaired with steel, but the alliance required something rarer: restraint. Victory in 1945 would demand tanks, bridges, aircraft, and the grinding superiority of logistics. But it would also demand a quieter conquest, defeating the coalition's worst instincts before those instincts could do what the Germans could not. When people say Montgomery was stripped of 200,000 Americans, they often imagine punishment, an angry coalition snatching forces away to settle a personal score. But the ledger of January 1945 tells a different story. Montgomery did not lose soldiers as a sentence. He lost access to a particular kind of power, the power to speak as if those soldiers belonged to his narrative. The handback was not a raid on his competence, it was a correction to his claim. In coalition war, troops can be placed under another nation's direction when circumstances demand it. That was the emergency logic of the bulge. But there is a boundary that cannot be crossed without cost. American blood cannot be administered and then publicly claimed. It can be coordinated, supported, and, when necessary, directed for a shared purpose. It cannot be treated as proof of one commander's ownership of the story. When Montgomery's press conference arranged the battle around his steadiness, the alliance heard something dangerous: the suggestion that shared sacrifice could be converted into personal authorship. The transfer back was therefore a statement as much as a decision. It restored the American chain of accountability, but it also restored the moral shape of partnership. It signaled that emergency authority was conditional, and the condition was respect. The condition was the recognition that armies are not only instruments of war, they are extensions of national grief. Every division carries the weight of families, towns, and newspapers that will count the dead. When those losses are spoken of carelessly, the coalition does not merely feel offended, it feels violated. Afterward, Montgomery's public silence became its own evidence. A man who had never been shy about explaining his method suddenly had less to say about the episode that had made him so visible. Silence in wartime is rarely accidental. It can be an admission without words, a recognition that the ground has shifted. Even Montgomery, who believed morale required certainty performed, could sense that the performance had cost him something. He had misjudged allies not in their courage, but in their need for dignity. To understand why he reached for ownership, one must understand the psychology of prestige. Commanders crave recognition because war offers few other certainties. The battlefield is chaotic, the casualty lists relentless, and outcomes often hinge on weather, fuel, and luck, as much as on brilliance. In such a world, being seen, being credited, becomes a kind of anchor. Prestige promises that suffering had meaning, that decisions mattered, that the dead were part of a story that will be remembered correctly. For men who live among numbers and graves, recognition can feel like the only clean reward. Yet coalition war demands a different virtue. It demands restraint, the ability to share credit without resentment, and to accept that triumph is collective, even when the cost is unequal. That is not an easy virtue for a commander who has built his identity around control and clarity. But without it, coalitions decay. They become alliances in name and rivalries in practice. The enemy does not need to defeat them militarily. He only needs to let them defeat themselves emotionally. Bradley's quiet firmness looks different under this moral light. It was not pettiness. It was leadership. Protecting his men's dignity was part of protecting their fighting power, because a soldier who believes his sacrifice is respected fights with a steadier kind of endurance. Bradley did not demand that Britain diminish itself. He demanded that America not be diminished in return. He understood that respect is not decoration. It is structural. The irony is that the moment many remember as a quarrel over credit was, in truth, a lesson about what holds armies together. The greatest commanders are not always those who win the most ground or give the cleanest speeches. Sometimes they are the ones who keep the most people moving together, different nations, different egos, different griefs, without letting the story become a weapon aimed inward. We return to the map room where the war has been reduced to pins and grease pencil, then expanded again into the lives those pins represent. The air is warmer than the Ardennes, but the atmosphere still carries winter. A line is adjusted. A boundary is redrawn. In another kind of story, the climax would be a barrage or a river crossing. Here, the decisive act is judgment, an agreement that the emergency is over and that what was borrowed must be returned before it becomes poison. The armies shift back like tides. Headquarters signals change call signs. Liaison teams pack their bags and move to new desks. The paper trail follows, thick with annexes and coordination notes that look dull to anyone who has not watched a front collapse. Yet this is how modern coalitions survive, by treating command like a machine that must be recalibrated, not a stage that must be dominated. The crisis is resolved not by firepower, but by restraint, and restraint is rarer than shells. On the wider front, the Western Allies keep moving toward Germany with an efficiency that comes from reconnected systems. Logistics becomes the quiet engine, fuel dumps advancing, bridging units preparing crossings, repair teams keeping roads passable for the endless weight of trucks. Air power returns when weather permits, turning German movement into a daylight risk. Combined arms tightens into a rhythm that does not require myth to sustain it. Infantry to clear, armor to exploit, artillery to break, and engineers to open. The war is finished not by a single genius, but by coordinated pressure applied day after day. Years later, a veteran remembers the bulge and surprises himself with what remains most frightening. Not the shells, though he can still recall the sound. Not the cold, though he can still feel it in his bones. The scariest moments were the ones when he sensed something bigger than the enemy might break, that the Allies might split, that arguments at headquarters might become delays in the field, that pride might turn partnership into friction. He did not know the names of the men in the map room, but he knew instinctively that unity was another form of armor, and armor can crack. Montgomery's skill deserves its place in the record. He brought structure to a confused sector, and structure mattered. His flaw also deserves its place, the belief that competence entitles a man to ownership. In a national army, a commander can shape a narrative with fewer consequences. In a coalition, ownership becomes theft by implication, and even unintentional theft can wound. Montgomery did not lose his reputation because he was incompetent. He lost trust because he misread what partners required to keep fighting together. Bradley's restraint deserves equal weight, not because it was dramatic, but because it was strategic. He accepted the emergency decision when the enemy demanded it, then reclaimed authority when the coalition demanded it. His boundary was not vanity. It was a defense of dignity, and dignity is a strategic resource. Armies run on fuel and ammunition, but they also run on belief. The belief that sacrifice will be respected, that credit will be shared, that a soldier's suffering will not be filed under another man's glory. Eisenhower's leadership sits above them all like a quiet roof holding the house together. He did not win the bulge with a single order. He preserved the alliance with a series of limits, protocols, apologies, restored hierarchies, placed carefully where pressure threatened to burst. Coalitions are preserved not by pretending vanity does not exist, but by preventing it from becoming policy. In January 1945, that was the real victory in the map room. Not a move east, but a move back toward fairness. He didn't take those Americans to punish a man. He took them back to save an alliance.